Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad you had with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020
How you doing, Dave?
vision.
Doing great, Matt. Having some interesting February San Antonio weather. On Monday, it was 85.
Yep.
Today, it's 32. Tomorrow, 70. And then the next day, 32. So
Okay.
different weather patterns coming through here. But
Yeah, that's usually like high to low, but day to day, that's kind of wild.
yeah.
Well, we have to apologize to our listeners for missing last week. We were too busy celebrating our Super Bowl picks, having gotten the Rams right. But I got to tell you, it's gave me another good reason not to be a bettor. So my prediction was 28-21. And of course, the final score was 23-20, which, not bad. I mean, that's like a 90th percentile pick, I would say, something like that.
Right.
But if I was betting, I would have lost on the point spread and on the over-under. So, you bet at your own risk is, I think, the message there. But I was proud of the fact that I picked Cooper Kupp to get the MVP with a second touchdown to win the game at the end.
I thought you nailed it, though, with your assessment of the game. Lower scoring than we thought. Both defenses played pretty well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the Rams were kind of in line to win and got a whole bunch of high-priced players and finished the job. So another good game, a good playoff for the NFL.
Yeah, the whole playoffs were really incredible. Other than the first weekend, so many close games, very compelling outcomes, and great storylines. So we're not going to predict next year's champion just yet, or 2024, 2025. Let things settle a little bit, but stay tuned, right? Because we're on a pretty good hot streak here.
That's right.
So last night, you accidentally called me, and it sounded like you were having some big Tuesday celebration there in Geneva, but I guess it was a girls' basketball game. Yeah,
we had had the music playing in the background, and I saw that on my phone that I called you by accident, and you probably were wondering, what had happened to me, whether I'd been captured by some crew of 18-year-olds. But yeah, they won the playoff game, so now they're one game removed from the state. If they win, I think on Saturday, they'll then play in the state tournament the following Saturday, which is exciting.
Wow.
For them. So yeah,
that's great. All right, well, let's turn to Aristotle. We're moving along in book 5 up to chapters 8 and 9.
Yeah, so the two chapters 8 and 9 deal with two topics connected to one another. In chapter 8, Aristotle goes through the general means of preserving constitutions. And then in chapter 9, he talks about what I'll call the ruling qualities and how these ruling qualities lead to the preservation of constitutions. So what is the general way that you can prevent there being a regime change or preserve the constitution that you have? And then secondly, what type of leader do you need, and how can that help in the preservation of a constitution? So you may have found more or less examples of means to preserve constitutions, but I think, Matt, that I was able to list at least 7 ways in which you can preserve a constitution. So maybe I'll go through each of these, and then we'll say a few words about them, and then whether or not they still apply today. So first great means of preserving a constitution, according to Aristotle, is if the spirit of obedience to the law is present within a community. And he says that this has to be true even in small matters, so that in how you carry yourself, you have a spirit that's in obedience to the law. And you think of an example, I know this is, many a college campus or a high school campus suffers from the tragedy of the commons, right? Where you see kind of garbage pile up, this, that, and the other, a can left here, piece of paper left there, so that you go a couple days with that, and you could have a campus that was a total mess. So here Aristotle would say, the type of habit in which you throw away your garbage into the recycling plan or whatever it may be, that produces kind of something within you and others where the expectation is that you're always going to do the right thing, even when other people aren't looking. What do you make of that idea?
Yeah, well, I think about the broken windows thesis of James Q. Wilson and the implementation of that in New York City with Rudy Giuliani and others in the early 90s. And the idea was, that if you start enforcing laws against vagrancy or against property destruction that are kind of minor things, it seems like, then you create a culture of obedience that will affect ultimately more serious crime. And whether that was the solution or there were other causes that were in play, probably a combination of things, we had a dramatic turnaround in the safety of New York City over the course of the 1990s, and not just New York City. As some of those methods moved out, of course, big city crime went down a lot for decades, and it's only in the last couple of years it's begun to go back up. And so, if you go to New York City today, you begin to see some of the signs that some of these small violations of the law are being ignored. And I think there's an effort with the new mayor coming in to go back to some of those earlier, more successful methods. But I think that's a good illustration of how, as you're saying, that habit of obedience and the fact that people care, right? The message that people care about having an orderly community gets transferred to people that either say, okay, they don't care, so I can go and do my thing and cause trouble more broadly, or they do, and I better be careful because there's obviously somebody watching and concerned about this community.
Yeah, and then that leads to his second bit of advice on how to preserve constitutions. You can't rely upon political device or a public relations campaign. You can't fake your way into preserving a constitution. You actually have to do the things that actually guard against the change that is harmful. And I mean, you go back to New York, right? You could try to have a public relations campaign. This is New York, of course, right? The center of public relations campaigns. But in reality, the effort to deceive people through a campaign like that is not going to overcome the reality on the streets, what you see in the subway, et cetera, correct?
Right. And I think about just the way that the administration, at least to this point, has tried to manage the inflation concerns of people, sort of, well, it's not really that bad, or it's temporary. And people are looking at the gas pump and they're saying, nope, it's pretty serious. Or they're trying to buy a home and they're looking at the prices going up or interest rates rising. And, these are kind of things that you can't spin your way out of because they're right in front of people in their everyday practical living.
Here goes to number 3, that rulers in trying to preserve a constitution should treat one another and their fellow citizen in a spirit of equality. It seems like all of these bits of advice are connected to one another. You want to have a spirit that's obedient to the law. You want to not deceive people. And then here, thirdly, you want to treat one another and your fellow citizens in the spirit of equality. So if there's someone who's disenfranchised, if there's someone who's not part of the ruling powers, you don't treat them as the other. Right? You want to be welcoming and liberal to all.
Yeah, that's a big point in the next chapter as well, that it's critically important for oligarchs not to mistreat the many, and for Democrats not to mistreat the few. That's the orientation of the regime, maybe, but you want to maintain a stable order and actually maintain your position of power and authority. You do it with moderation, not with partisanship.
And this leads, I think, to the fourth bit of advice that he gives us, that it's better to have short tenure in office. So to not have individuals who are serving in office for a long time, who may get powerful and who may forget those who they lead, or not be willing to treat another as their equal. The tenure in the office produces a certain sheltering from reality. So the shorter the tenure, Aristotle says, the better in most constitutions. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a mixed blessing there, right? There's advantages to short terms in office, but I think one of the ways that you overcome the danger of long tenure in office is by having regular elections. So is it a bad thing to have individuals serve multiple Senate terms, or, a handful of terms in the House, or 2 terms as president? Not necessarily, but you need to have that periodic accountability. It needs to be real accountability. So this is one of the dangers in our day, is that because of gerrymandering, there's so many uncompetitive House districts, there really isn't that accountability every 2 years, maybe in a primary, but not in the general election. It's difficult to actually hold the office holder accountable in a way that is intended by those frequent elections. So I think, there is benefits to experience, and certainly we have people that are wise and prudent in their judgments. You don't want to just throw them out of office for no good reason, but it is important that there be that measure of accountability that returns them to the people, that aligns their interest with their duty and encourages responsibility on their part.
Yeah, and I mean, that's tied to, I think, what he'd argue is the 5th, 6th, and 7th bits of advice here on preserving constitutions. It all has to do with the relationship between holding office and gaining for oneself by the holding of office. So, fifthly, he argues that you ought to always be taking into account kind of general economic trends. Here you mentioned inflation. So what has inflation done over the course of the last 25 years to the general well-being of the middle-class worker, right? That would be a question I think that Aristotle would want us to consider. So are wages increasing at a rate with the economy, or does the middle class find itself in a more difficult position over the course of time? And I mean, here he's not just talking about the middle class, but the wealthy, the poor. You always want to be calibrating where things are on a yearly census basis. So it's kind of interesting here that he goes into a discussion of economics, because of course, many a revolution, right, has begun, right, over a struggle over property or labor, et cetera. Correct?
Yeah, certainly we see that even going back to early American history. Shays' Rebellion was a great catalyst for the Constitutional Convention, and the concerns about debtors versus creditors that were tied up in that, and of course many other examples of that over the course of our history.
So 6 and 7 tied to this. 6, make sure that an office holder never has too much power, whether that power is derived from friends or money. And then 7th, try to make sure that a state, he writes, is administered and so regulated by law that its magistrates cannot possibly make money. That's kind of a great irony, right? When you look at Washington, D.C. and its surrounding zip codes, there's a lot of good money to be made outside of the Beltway. And it shows itself in many of these cities that average housing prices are 1.2, 1.5 million, with large government supplied retirements, et cetera, where people have done quite well for themselves, not simply by being a magistrate, but by serving the administrative state over the last 50, 100 years as it's grown.
Right. I think that's the challenge in our time. You don't really get a great salary by being a member of Congress, right? A couple $100,000. Many folks are making more than that in the various professions. And a lot of the people that are in office would be making more than that if they were in private business. But when you leave office, you have all these connections, lobbying opportunities. You've got the corporate boards, other chances for easy money as a speaker or things of this sort. And so there's a real opportunity to leverage that position for power. And like you're saying, to be tied into the administrative state and kind of seeking your fortune through the successes of those government institutions that are so central in Washington and around a number of the more prominent state capitals as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a general principle here. In the United States, you don't get rich in office per se from holding office. But, you think about Hunter Biden, right? You think about the ways that families leverage their connections sometimes in ways that might be legal, but maybe not ethical. And just kind of the general sense that if you're well connected with the administration, with the regime, that you're likely to do well. And that will show up in terms of college admissions. That might show up in terms of other opportunities for relatives and those connected to you, and those that are favorable to the regime, even if they're not office holders, seem to do pretty well also. So I think there's kind of a general principle here that's broader than just what the salary is of an office holder, that is a matter of concern in our day, that the ruling class uses positions of authority to benefit themselves and to sort of reproduce themselves generation by generation.
Yeah, and I think that general spirit feeds into the argument that he's making in this chapter, and that is that the best way to preserve a regime, a constitution, is if that constitution practices equality rightly understood, understands justice as equality rightly understood. And to the degree that it doesn't, and this has been a common theme throughout the politics, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have an unhealthy divide find its way into a political community that leads to a revolution and perhaps the dissolution of whatever that political community is. Well, so moving on to chapter 9 of book 5, continuing on with this theme of preserving constitutions, but now the subject is, well, what are the qualities of the ruler? What are the qualities of the individuals who hold the highest offices? So he lists 3, and they're really clear qualities that rulers ought to have. First, loyalty to the established constitution. So this office holder should be loyal. Second, the greatest administrative capacity. So secondly, this individual ought to have skill. And then thirdly, virtue and justice of the kind proper to each form of government. And this isn't the same, he says, in all governments. The quality of justice differs for different regimes, but that office holder must have a virtue and a justice that is in alignment with that regime. So loyalty, skill, and virtue. What do you make of these 3?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important combination. And this was actually a chapter that I used in my dissertation in evaluating the statesmen of the second generation, the leaders after the revolutionary leaders and before Lincoln, and looking at how they failed in significant ways to measure up to both Lincoln on the one end and the founders on the other. And it was really in these particular qualities that you could see them as falling short. So as Aristotle points out in the chapter, if you have 2 but not the other, it doesn't really work. Mm-hmm. So being loyal, having the right sense of justice and virtue, but not having the capacity to judge prudently the right measure, right, the means and ends, you fail anyway, right, despite your best of intentions. And if you have all the qualities of prudence and you have virtue, but you don't actually love this regime, then those qualities will lead you to transform the regime into something else. And rather than preserving in the regime, you end up being a revolutionary, whether you intend that or not. And so you work through the different combinations here, and you see the fact that all 3 of these really have to come together for a leader to accomplish the purpose that Aristotle is laying out. Now, maybe you don't need to preserve the regime, right? Maybe the regime is not worthy of being preserved, and that's a different question. But if we're taking up the question of how do you maintain a regime over time, without these 3 qualities coming together in the political leaders, it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting that same dissertation that you write on American history in between the founding and the Civil War was like the dissertation I wrote about the rise and decline of Athens as a regime, on the same principle that here you have a regime that's worthy, that's defined well in Pericles' funeral oration, and that is ordered well by Pericles, who, in his own words, has knowledge, has the ability to communicate that knowledge, but most importantly, loves Athens. But what comes after Pericles, after he dies? A set of rulers who lack a combination of these skills, which brings us to the point, well, what do you do in a situation where you have to make a choice between a good general, this is an example he uses, a good general who's a bad man, and not a friend to the Constitution, or another man who's loyal and just, but doesn't have the administrative capacity. And here he says something quite interesting, right? That the rule as to how you judge is based upon the rarer quality. So if it's more difficult in that situation to be a good general and to marshal your troops, you'll probably take the bad man, right, over the good man who has no ability on the battlefield. Interesting comments, huh?
Yeah, and you wonder how well that works out historically. Right? You think about your own example. Somebody who's a great military commander for the Athenian forces, but doesn't love the regime. Does that military victory actually redound to the good of the regime, or does it redound to the good of the commander?
Right. Well, of course, you're mentioning Alcibiades here, and I think it's interesting, right? Is the fate of the regime already been determined by that point, because it's produced a person like Alcibiades that is not loyal to it or sees himself above it. So anyway, I think that as he moves on here and he talks about these different qualities, I think that one of the things that's important to remember is to go back to this distinction between what the preserving principle is within one regime and what it is within another regime. So all of the advice that he is giving us here is really centered on an application that's particular to a regime. And this kind of leads to, I think his most important point here, because it's about rule, but it's also about the preservation of a political community. He writes, "Of all the things which I have mentioned, that which most contributes to the permanence of constitutions is the adaptation of education to the form of government. And yet in our own day, this principle is universally neglected. The best laws, though sanctioned by every citizen of the state, will be of no avail unless the young are trained by habit and education in the spirit of the Constitution." A really valuable advice here in his day and ours. You will not have good rulers unless you have a good educational system. And that educational system is necessary for the regime to exist because education in the regime is necessary. And I think that's something that our founders knew well in the United States. And I think that that's something that we kind of take for granted in the 21st century, that we put someone in a 6th grade or 8th grade civics class, that's enough. They'll get out and we'll be good thereafter as long as the economy is running well. And I think we're going to soon realize that very well may not be the case, that education that's so necessary to the preservation of the American regime cannot be set aside.
Yeah, I think there's two mistakes you can make here. So he talks about the spirit of the regime. You need to educate them in the spirit of the regime. And I think that you might take that as being kind of a rah-rah patriotism, right? You want to, yay us, and kind of teach them this vision of your community that makes them uncritical of it. And that's actually not what he's talking about, right? He wants the spirit of the regime for a normal regime includes its dangers, its weak points, its tendency toward injustice, as well as its tendency toward justice, right? As we've seen his analysis of regimes all the way through this work, we've seen him talking about how each regime gets some of justice right, but misses other elements of it. And so to educate someone in the spirit of the regime is to appreciate both the good and the weaknesses of that regime and prepare them to combat those weaknesses. So you think about the example of a democracy, which he uses toward the end of his discussion. And the danger there is too much freedom, right? A kind of license, a breakdown of any kind of restraint. And so to actually educate people in the spirit of a democracy is not to encourage them in that direction, say, hey, yeah, this is democracy, do whatever you want, but to say, no, this is democracy, so be self-governing. This is democracy, so be a person who applies the restraints to yourself that the laws won't apply to you. Right? That we're not going to rely on law to do that. We're going to rely on you seeking the good in community with others. And that's going to be a necessary part of that education for this democracy to succeed. Otherwise, its inherent flaws and faults will overrun the regime and lead to its downfall or its destruction.
So if you're listening to this and you want to move forward and on a front that is contemporary, you could do no better than to pick up Wilfred Maclay's Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story, and read through his history of the United States, a history that ends with an epilogue in which he points out just what I think you've commented on, Matt, that really kind of captures that Aristotelian orientation to political education. Clay writes, "This book is offered as a contribution to the making of American citizens. As such, it is a patriotic endeavor as well as a scholarly one, and it never loses sight of what there is to celebrate and cherish in the American achievement. That doesn't mean it is an uncritical celebration. The two things, celebration and criticism, are not necessarily enemies. Love is the foundation of the wisest criticism, and criticism is the essential partner of an honest and enduring love. We live in a country, let us hope, in which our flaws can always be openly discussed, and where criticism and dissent can be regarded not as betrayal, thought crimes, but as essential ingredients in the flourishing of our polity and our common life." Can you put it any better than that?
No, because that's the second problem, right? So the first problem I'm saying is the love without criticism. The second problem, which of course we find mostly on the political left, is criticism without love, right? And so it's putting those two things together that educates young people and everybody else in the nature of the regime in such a way that it preserves the regime and pushes it toward the best version of itself, which is, of course, central to Aristotle's teaching on regime preservation.
All right, I think our crystal ball will take up some of the same, correct?
That's right. So let's turn to the crystal ball. So next Tuesday, we have President Biden's second State of the Union address. Last year, when he gave his first, which was on his 100th day in office, April 28th, he had a 53.1% approval rating and, of course, 42.1% disapproval. Now, as he prepares to give the speech this year, those numbers have been essentially reversed. About 41.4% approval. This is the RealClearPolitics average, 52.9% disapproving. And of course, with midterm elections coming soon, I kind of wonder what the president will try to do to turn around his and his party's electoral fortunes. He's going to stay in kind of partisan mode, which he's been in largely during this last year, or will he try to return to some of the language and feel of the 2020 presidential campaign? So what I want to do, Dave, is get your predictions on three fronts here, three matters of concern, issue areas that are likely to come up in that speech, and ask you what you think he will have to say on those items. Okay, so the first one is Russia and Ukraine. And of course, there may be more developments between now and then, but what do you expect him to say? What's the message to the American people that you expect him to convey on that front?
Well, I don't remember this movie from 1997, Wag the Dog, but I think it kind of came as a precursor to the West Wing approach to foreign policy, domestic policy, and all the rest, in which the story behind the story is what's important. And if you can spin things the right way, then you'll gain a political advantage. And of course, Aristotle just told us that this is not good advice. But it seems to be the advice that a lot of brokers in Washington, D.C. have taken up. And I think that's where he's going to go on Russia and Ukraine. I think you're going to see a little bit of a wagging of the dog of we can't let this stand, that this goes against the fundamentals of the world community. And yet it fails to realize the truth, the reality that's on the ground. And you can wag the dog all you want, but if you're not in control, it doesn't really matter. And I think that will be an attempt to gain control of a situation that in the next news cycle and the next Russian movement will show that there's really nothing that he can do. You can't, call on the dogs of war if you're not really interested in fighting against whatever maneuvers Putin wants to do in that part of the world.
I think the focus will be on the domestic political consequences. So we know on both the left and the right, there's a real disinterest in getting involved in foreign conflicts. And so I think there's going to be an emphasis on the expectation of success from various restrictions on the flow of capital and things of this sort, sanctions regime that's being put in place. and probably some discussion of the consequences for energy prices, things of this sort that might be kind of the domestic fallout of this, and attempt to kind of manage that worry and expectation there. All right, how about on inflation?
Yeah, I expect something like this. The American economy is strong, and we're building it back better. You probably are not tuning in, but you are tuning in to the fact that when you fill up your gas tank the next day, it's $73. And doesn't feel on your wallet that it's strong and it's building back better. It doesn't feel that way when you're getting groceries that are $25 more than they were, last year. And it doesn't feel that way when you kind of look at the balance of what's in your checking account. And yes, you may be getting 2-3% more than you were in wages last year, but on balance, you're doing worse.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a focus on supply chain problems, COVID, kind of temporary issues. No mention of the spending of the last few years, which is by many accounts a key contributor to inflation. But I think it's going to be the external, right? Government is the solution, not the problem. All right, lastly, the issue of American democracy. Where do you think he goes there, Dave?
Yeah, here I think he pivots with world events and says, one of the things that we cherish about our life is that we are not led by dictators. Yes, we've had some within our midst who would want to be ruled by such types, but our mission as a country is to preserve democracy for the rest of the world. There'll be something kind of Wilsonian, tied back to kind of attacking his political opponents at home and pointing out their similarities to foreign dictators abroad.
Yeah, I think there will be some underlying current of Trump and Putin and those kind of connections. But I think he's going to be careful not to go the route he was in the debate over the voting bill and paint with such a broad brush that the average Republican conservative thinks, oh, he's calling me a racist. He's calling me a defender of segregation or a person who's against voting or something. I think he's going to kind of shift a little bit more to presidential campaign mode and try to be more inclusive in his language, even while maintaining the underlying critique of Trump and Trumpism. Yeah, we will see what happens on Tuesday night. In the meantime, we thank you as always for listening to the show. Please remember to subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget, you can contact us at democracyinamerica today@gmail.com. And we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.